That belongs in a museum, not on a firing line. The voice was young, sharp, and carried the swagger of someone who believed expensive gear made the shooter. Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane stood with his arms crossed, staring at the weathered bolt-action rifle resting on the shooting bench. The old man sitting behind it, perhaps 70, maybe older, didn't look up. He just kept running a soft cloth along the rifle's wooden stock, his movements slow and deliberate, as if the world around him didn't exist. The Silver Creek Range stretched out before them, a civilian facility that had become a training ground for military units from nearby Fort Carson. The morning sun was already brutal, baking the high desert floor and creating shimmering waves of heat that danced above the hard-packed earth. Steel targets dotted the landscape at various distances, 300, 500, 800, and 1,000 yards, each one a challenge, a test of skill and equipment. Kane stepped closer, his shadow falling over the bench. His boots crunched on the gravel. He wore tactical pants with reinforced knees, a moisture-wicking shirt that displayed his unit patch, and wrap-around sunglasses that hid his eyes but couldn't hide his contempt. "Sir," he said, his voice taking on the forced patience of someone explaining something to a child. "I'm going to have to ask you to pack that antique up. This is a designated range for Special Forces qualification. We're running live fire drills with precision equipment, and that," he gestured dismissively at the rifle, his finger never quite touching it, as if the age might be contagious, "is a liability." Robert Caldwell, 82 years old, with hands marked by decades of wind, sun, and the weight of a rifle, finally paused. He folded the cloth neatly, the edges perfectly aligned, and set it aside with the care of a man who had learned long ago that discipline lived in the smallest gestures. His eyes, a pale gray that seemed to hold more stillness than the desert air around them, lifted to meet Kane's. He didn't speak. He simply looked. It was a look that had once frozen enemy soldiers in their tracks, a gaze that had assessed wind speed, distance, and the heartbeat between life and death. But Kane didn't know that. He only saw an old man who wasn't showing proper deference. Kane's jaw tightened. He was used to immediate compliance, to the respect that came with the uniform and the rank. This old man's silence felt like defiance, and it grated against his pride like sandpaper on a raw wound. Behind Kane, 3 other men approached. They were all part of his unit, Green Berets conducting advanced sniper training at the civilian range. The Army had contracts with Silver Creek for specialized courses, and these men were the elite of the elite, or so they believed. They wore tactical pants, moisture-wicking shirts, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from being very good at something very dangerous. Their rifles, custom-built precision instruments worth more than most people's cars, rested in padded cases on the benches behind them. "Problem, Sarge?" one of them asked, a wiry man with a thick beard and wrap-around sunglasses named Collins. His tone suggested he already knew the answer and was looking forward to the entertainment. "Just explaining to our guest here that this isn't the place for historical reenactments," Kane replied, his voice loud enough for the handful of other shooters on the range to hear. A few heads turned. Conversations quieted. The range, which had been filled with the intermittent crack of rifle fire and the low murmur of spotters calling corrections, fell into an expectant hush. Collins glanced at the rifle on the bench and let out a low whistle, the kind you'd make when you saw something pitifully inadequate. "Jesus, is that thing even safe to fire? Looks like it should be behind glass in the Smithsonian." The third man, a compact, muscular operator with forearms like steel cables named Torres, leaned in to get a closer look. He made a show of examining it, his head tilted like he was studying a curiosity in a roadside antique shop. "What is that? A Model 70? My grandpa had one of those. Used it for deer hunting before the barrel wore out, and he had to scrap it." Kane smirked, warming to the audience. "Probably held together with wood glue and prayers. I'm surprised it hasn't fallen apart just sitting there." The fourth member of the team, a younger man named Briggs, who rarely spoke but always laughed at the right moments, chuckled on cue. He was the newest addition, eager to prove himself, eager to belong. Robert Caldwell remained seated, his posture relaxed but rooted, like an old tree that had weathered 1,000 storms and would weather 1,000 more. He reached for the rifle, not in aggression, but with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred. His fingers traced the worn checkering on the grip, the smooth curve of the bolt handle polished by decades of use. The metal was no longer blued. Time had given it a matte, ghostly finish. The wood was scarred, deep gouges, burns, and stains that no amount of oil could erase. Kane saw the flaws. He saw outdated technology. He saw weakness. He didn't see the history. He didn't see the ridge in Afghanistan where that rifle had ended a Soviet officer's command from 1,100 yards. He didn't see the jungles of Central America where it had provided overwatch for extraction teams. He didn't see the prototype blueprints that had been studied, refined, and eventually became the foundation of an entire generation of military sniper systems. "Sir," Kane said again, his patience thinning like ice over warming water, "this range is about to get very loud and very fast. We've got live drills at 600, 800, and 1,000 yards. We're testing new loads, new optics, and running qualification standards. That setup you've got there," he gestured at the simple fixed-power scope mounted in old-style rings, "isn't going to cut it. You'll be a distraction at best, a danger at worst. And frankly, I can't have my team's focus compromised by worrying about whether your rifle is going to blow up in your face." For the first time, Robert spoke. His voice was quiet, textured like gravel tumbling in a creek bed, but it carried across the firing line with surprising clarity. "I'll stay out of your way." Kane's eyebrows shot up. His expression shifted from condescension to genuine irritation. "Stay out of our way, old man. You are in our way." He turned to his team, raising his voice so everyone on the range could hear. "Get the barriers set up. Let's cordon off lanes 1 through 6. Pops here can sit at the far end if he wants to pretend he's still relevant." Collins chuckled, a sharp, ugly sound. "You even know how to dial that scope, sir? Or is it just point and hope? Because I gotta tell you, these targets aren't exactly standing still out there with the wind and mirage," Torres added, his tone falsely helpful, dripping with mockery. "There's a gun shop about 10 miles south, just off the highway. They've got some nice entry-level stuff. Remington 700S, Savage Axis, modern rifles with actual adjustments. Real shooter-friendly for someone getting back into the hobby." Briggs, not wanting to be left out, chimed in. "Yeah, and they've got classes too. Basic marksmanship, sight-in services. Might be a better fit, you know?" The humiliation was intentional, carefully orchestrated, designed to push the old man off the range through sheer social pressure. It was a tactic Kane had used before in training environments, in units, in places where hierarchy and dominance mattered. Assert control. Mock the outsider. Make them feel small. Make them leave on their own. Robert Caldwell didn't move. He set the rifle back on the bench, aligning it with a precision that was almost mechanical, the buttstock perfectly parallel to the edge, the barrel pointing safely downrange. He reached into his range bag, a faded canvas thing that looked like it had survived a war, which it had, and pulled out a single box of ammunition. The box was old, its cardboard soft and faded, the print on the label barely legible. He opened it with care and removed 5 rounds, laying them out in a neat row beside the rifle, each one placed with the same meticulous attention. Kane watched, his irritation turning to something closer to genuine anger. This old man wasn't intimidated. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't reacting, and that was unacceptable. It undermined Kane's authority. It made him look weak in front of his team. "All right, that's it," Kane said, his voice hardening, the friendliness completely gone now, replaced by the flat tone of command. He took a step forward, close enough now that he could smell the faint scent of gun oil and old leather coming from the man, close enough to invade his space, to use physical presence as a weapon. "I tried to be polite. I tried to give you an out, but you're not listening. So let me be absolutely clear. This is a professional training environment. You're out of your depth. That rifle is a joke. And you," he leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "are a liability. Pack it up now, or I'll have the range officer escort you out." The moment hung in the air, sharp and brittle, like glass about to shatter. At the far end of the range, standing in the small observation tower that overlooked the entire facility, Range Safety Officer Dale Mitchell had been watching the entire exchange. He was a retired Marine, a man in his late 50s with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. He'd done 2 tours in Iraq, one in Afghanistan, and had spent the last decade running this range, teaching civilians and hosting military contracts. He'd recognized Robert Caldwell the moment the old man had signed in that morning. The name had triggered a memory, a whisper from decades ago, a legend told in the armory and the barracks and the quiet corners of bases where the real warriors gathered. He'd heard stories about a man who had trained an entire generation of snipers, who had written manuals that were still classified, who had made shots that defied belief. Mitchell had tried to stay out of it, to let the young guns have their range time and their egos. But Kane's escalation was crossing a line. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't training. This was cruelty. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd been given years ago, a direct line to the base command for situations that required discretion, for moments when civilians and military intersected in ways that could either build bridges or burn them. The phone rang twice. Base operations. Captain Hernandez speaking. Captain, this is Dale Mitchell out at Silver Creek Range. I've got a situation developing. Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane and his team are harassing a civilian shooter. There was a pause. Harassing. What kind of harassment are we talking about? Verbal, physical. Mitchell chose his words carefully, his eyes still on the scene unfolding below. The kind where they don't know who they're talking to, sir. The kind that's about to become a very serious problem for everyone involved. The civilian's name is Robert Caldwell. Silence. Complete total silence on the other end of the line. Mitchell could almost hear the gears turning, the name registering, the implications dawning. Then, in a completely different tone, sharp and urgent, "Say that name again." Robert Caldwell, Caldwell. Jesus Christ, Captain Hernandez breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let him leave. And for God's sake, keep those idiots from making it worse. I'm notifying Colonel Bradford right now. He needs to know." The line went dead. Mitchell set the phone down and looked back at the firing line. Kane was now standing directly over Robert, using his physical presence as intimidation, his body language screaming dominance. This was about to get very interesting. Back at the firing line, Kane had moved even closer. He was now standing directly over Robert, his shadow completely engulfing the old man. "You deaf, old man?" I said. "Pack it up. Don't make me call security." Robert Caldwell finally stood. The movement was slow, his knees protesting with the kind of stiffness that comes from old injuries and older age. His back was stiff, his shoulders slightly rounded. But when he rose to his full height, still an inch or two shorter than Kane, there was something in his bearing that made the younger man hesitate for just a fraction of a second. It wasn't size, it wasn't muscle, it was presence. Robert looked at him, not up, not down, just at him, and in that gaze was a weight, a gravity that Kane couldn't name but could feel pressing against his chest like a hand. "I paid for my lane time," Robert said simply, his voice even, without heat or anger. "I'll shoot when you're done." Kane's face flushed red. This was open defiance now, and his team was watching. The other shooters on the range were watching. He couldn't back down. Not in front of them, not without losing face. "You want to shoot? Fine." Kane turned to Collins, his voice loud and theatrical. "Set a target at 800 yards. Let's see what Grandpa's miracle rifle can do." He looked back at Robert, his smile cruel and cold. "One shot. You miss. You pack up and leave. You hit. We'll leave you alone. Deal?" Robert didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the rifle on the bench, his expression unreadable, his mind somewhere far away. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he said, 800 yards. The words seemed to trigger something. His eyes unfocused, and for a moment, he wasn't standing on a civilian range in Colorado. He was somewhere else, somewhere colder. Somewhere where the wind didn't just blow, it cut through fabric and flesh and bone. The mountains of Afghanistan, winter of 1987. He was 34 years old, lying prone on a ridge so cold that his breath formed instant clouds of frost. The altitude was over 10,000 feet. The air was thin. Every breath was a conscious effort. The same rifle, though newer then, the wood still rich and oiled, The bluing, still dark, was pressed against his shoulder. Below him, in a narrow valley carved by ancient rivers and ancient wars, a Soviet convoy was moving. 3 trucks, 2 armored personnel carriers, and a command vehicle. The target was a single man, a GRU officer whose intelligence network had devastated resistance operations for 6 months. His capture or elimination was critical. The shot was 1,100 yards, through a mountain pass where the wind funneled and swirled in ways no chart could predict, where temperature gradients created invisible currents, where the thin air changed every calculation. He didn't have a ballistic calculator. He didn't have a rangefinder. He didn't have a spotter. He had his eyes, his breath, and the rifle. He watched a piece of cloth tied to a rock 400 yards downrange. He watched the way snow lifted off the ridgeline. He felt the pressure of the wind against his left cheek. He adjusted the scope. 2 clicks up, 1 click right. He waited for the wind to pause, that brief moment between gusts where the world held its breath. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked. The bullet flew. Through the thin mountain air it traveled, dropping, drifting, fighting the wind, and 1,100 yards away, through the window of a command vehicle, it found its target. The convoy stopped. Chaos erupted. And on the ridge, Robert Caldwell had already packed his rifle and begun the long, silent descent through the snow. The memory faded like smoke. Robert blinked, and he was back on the range, the desert sun pressing down on him like a weight. Kane was still standing there, smirking, waiting for an answer, completely unaware of the ghost he was challenging. "All right," Robert said quietly. 800 yards. Kane's grin widened, sharp and mean. "Collins, set the steel. Let's give Grandpa his moment." As Collins jogged downrange with a pair of binoculars to confirm the target placement, Kane turned to his team, his voice low and smug. "This is going to be embarrassing for him, but maybe he'll learn something about staying in his lane." Torres laughed. "Think he'll even hit the berm? I'm betting he pulls the shot left." "Not a chance," Kane replied. "That rifle probably shoots 3-inch groups at 100 yards. At 800, he'll be lucky to hit the mountain behind the target." Briggs, ever eager, added, "Should we start a pool? I'll put $20 on him not even firing. I think he'll chicken out." 10 minutes later, the target, a 12-inch steel plate, was confirmed at 802 yards. The number was called out over the radio, and Collins jogged back, slightly out of breath, his face red from the exertion and the heat. The range had gone completely quiet now. Other shooters had stopped what they were doing, their own drills forgotten. This had become the show, the confrontation, the old man versus the cocky Special Forces team. Kane gestured theatrically toward the firing line, his movements exaggerated, playing to the crowd. "All yours, Pops. 1 shot. Make it count. And remember, you miss, you're gone." Robert Caldwell walked slowly to the bench. His gait was stiff, his movements deliberate. He sat down, settling into a position that was both economical and precise, his body forming a perfect platform. He loaded a single round into the rifle's chamber, the brass sliding home with a soft metallic click. He closed the bolt, the action smooth and well-worn, a motion he'd performed 10,000 times. He didn't rush. He didn't fidget. He didn't perform. He simply existed in the moment, his breathing slow and controlled. He looked downrange, his eyes scanning the target, the terrain, the shimmer of heat rising from the desert floor. He was reading the wind, not with instruments, but with senses honed over decades. The way the mirage bent, the way dust lifted and fell, the feel of the air against his skin. Kane stood off to the side, arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. He glanced at his watch, making a show of it. "Any day now, old-timer. We've got actual work to do." Robert exhaled slowly, half a breath, holding the rest. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, the pad of his finger just barely making contact. The rifle was an extension of his body now, not a tool but a part of him. The wind shifted, just a breath, barely noticeable to anyone else, but he felt it, a change in pressure against his left cheek, a momentary lull. He squeezed. The rifle barked, the sound sharp and flat in the open air, swallowed almost immediately by the vast emptiness of the desert. The recoil pushed back into his shoulder, familiar and honest, like greeting an old friend. For a long, breathless moment there was only silence. The bullet was in flight, invisible, carrying with it the pride of a young sergeant and the quiet dignity of an old warrior. Then, from 802 yards away, a clear, unmistakable ping rang out across the range. The steel plate swung violently on its chain, the impact dead center, the sound echoing back like a bell. The range erupted. Shooters from other lanes started clapping, a few letting out impressed whistles and shouts. An older man in a Vietnam veteran cap stood up and saluted. Even Torres muttered, barely audible, "No fucking way." Kane's smile vanished. It didn't fade. It vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. His jaw clenched. His fists tightened. He stared downrange, then at the rifle, then at the old man, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. "Lucky shot," he said finally, his voice tight and strained. "Wind was probably in your favor. Beginner's luck." Robert Caldwell stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He opened the bolt, ejecting the spent casing. It tumbled to the ground, glinting in the sun like a fallen coin. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He didn't even acknowledge the applause. He simply began to pack his rifle away, wrapping it in the same soft cloth, placing it in the worn case with reverence. "Hey!" Kane snapped, stepping forward, his voice rising. "I'm talking to you. That was luck, wasn't it? Admit it. There's no way you calculated that wind. You just got lucky." Robert paused, his hands resting on the rifle case. He turned, and for the first time, there was something other than calm in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. It was disappointment, the kind of disappointment a teacher feels when a student refuses to learn. "Son," he said quietly, each word measured and deliberate, "luck is what you call skill when you don't understand it." Kane's face went red, his fists clenching at his sides. He opened his mouth to respond, likely to escalate, likely to make this physical. But before he could, the sound of tires on gravel cut through the tension like a knife. A black SUV, moving fast, pulled into the range parking lot, dust billowing behind it. Its door opened before it had fully stopped, and a man in uniform stepped out. He wore the rank insignia of a full colonel, his boots polished to a mirror shine, his uniform immaculate, his bearing that of someone who had commanded in combat and suffered no fools. Colonel James Bradford. He was 56 years old, a career officer who had led men in Iraq and Afghanistan, who had earned his rank through competence and courage, and he was striding toward the firing line with the kind of purpose that made every man on that range straighten their posture instinctively. Behind him, 2 MPs emerged from the vehicle, their expressions neutral but alert, their hands resting near their sidearms. Kane's stomach dropped. The blood drained from his face. He recognized the colonel immediately. Everyone on base did. This was not a man you wanted angry at you. Bradford stopped 10 feet from the group, his eyes sweeping over Kane, his team, and finally settling on Robert Caldwell. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his jaw, a fire in his eyes. And then, in front of everyone on that range, in front of the shooters and the spectators and the stunned Special Forces team, Colonel James Bradford came to attention. His heels clicked together with parade ground precision. His right hand snapped up in the sharpest, most respectful salute Kane had ever seen. It wasn't the casual salute given to a passing officer. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture of protocol. It was the salute given to legends, to heroes, to men who had built the very foundations of the world soldiers now walked on. "Mr. Caldwell," Bradford said, his voice clear and strong, resonating across the silent range. "It's an honor, sir." Robert Caldwell, standing beside his rifle case, slowly straight. He returned the salute with a tired nod, his hand moving to his brow and then falling with the grace of long practice. Bradford held his salute for a full 3 seconds before dropping his hand. He then turned to Kane, and the warmth in his eyes was replaced by something arctic. "Staff Sergeant Kane," he said, his voice low and dangerous, the kind of voice that promised consequences. "Do you have any idea who you've been harassing?" Kane's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His brain had short-circuited. He looked from the colonel to Robert to his team, searching for answers that weren't there. Bradford didn't wait for an answer. He gestured toward Robert, his hand steady, his voice gaining volume. This man is Robert Caldwell, Chief Warrant Officer, retired. He is one of the founding instructors of the U.S. Army Sniper School at Fort Benning. He served in classified operations across 3 decades, operations you don't have clearance to hear about. He has trained more snipers than you've met in your entire career. And that rifle, Bradford pointed at the case, that museum piece you mocked, that antique you dismissed, is the original prototype for the M24 sniper weapon system. He designed it. He built it, he tested it in combat, and he used it to make shots that are still classified 30 years later. The silence on the range was total. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Bradford continued, his voice cutting like a blade. That 800-yard shot you just witnessed, that's nothing. That's a warm-up drill for him. In 1987, in the Hindu Kush Mountains during Operation Cyclone, he made a confirmed kill at 1,400 yards in a snowstorm with that same rifle. The target was a Soviet intelligence officer. The mission saved an entire resistance network. The shot is still used as a case study in advanced sniper training. Kane looked like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. He holds records, Bradford said, his voice relentless, that have never been broken. He wrote the manual on wind reading that you studied in sniper school, though clearly you didn't absorb it. And you, Bradford's voice dropped to a whisper, somehow more menacing than any shout could ever be. You treated him like a fool. You mocked him. You tried to humiliate him. In front of your team. In front of this range. You disgraced your uniform, your unit, and yourself. Kane was shaking now, visibly trembling, his face a mask of shame and horror. Bradford turned back to Robert, his expression softening immediately. Sir, on behalf of the United States Army and every sniper who has ever benefited from your teaching, I apologize for the conduct of these men. It's inexcusable. There is no justification. You deserve better. Robert shook his head slowly, his voice quiet but firm. They're young, Colonel. They don't know what they don't know yet. We were all arrogant once. That's no excuse, Bradford replied, his tone brooking no argument. Then, turning back to Kane, you and your team will report to my office at 0600 tomorrow morning. You will spend the next 30 days in remedial training, not on shooting, on respect, on humility, on the history of the men who built the programs you benefit from. You will read every after-action report Mr. Caldwell filed that's been declassified. You will study the evolution of sniper doctrine, and you will learn what it means to honor those who came before you. Dismissed. Kane saluted weakly, his hand barely making it to his brow. He turned to leave, his legs stiff, his team following in stunned silence. As they walked away, Robert Caldwell finished packing his rifle. He slung the case over his shoulder, the weight familiar and comforting, and started toward the parking lot. Colonel Bradford walked alongside him, his posture still formal. Can I give you a ride, sir? It's the least I can do. I'm all right, Colonel, Robert said, his voice gentle. But thank you. Bradford nodded, then paused. Sir, if I may ask, why didn't you just tell them who you were? You could have ended that in seconds. Robert stopped walking. He looked out at the desert horizon, where the heat made the mountains waver like a mirage. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. Because rank and reputation shouldn't be why someone shows you respect, Colonel. Decency should. Kindness should. If a man only respects you because of what you've done, he doesn't respect you at all. He respects your resume. He adjusted the rifle case on his shoulder and continued walking, leaving the colonel standing in the dust, watching a legend disappear into the shimmering heat. 3 weeks later, Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane stood in a small classroom on base. The walls were lined with photos, black and white images of men in fatigues, holding rifles, standing in deserts and jungles and mountains. The faces were young, hard, and serious. In front of him was a presentation on the evolution of military sniper doctrine. On the screen was a black and white photo from 1984. A young man in desert fatigues, lean and focused, holding a rifle that Kane now recognized. Beside him was a target at an impossible distance, and a small notation in the corner, 1,310 yards, 35 miles per hour crosswind, confirmed. The caption read, CWO, Robert Caldwell, Advanced Wind Deflection Study, Classified Operation. Kane stared at the photo for a long time, his chest tight with shame, and something else, something like awe. After class, he drove to the Silver Creek Range. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. He found Robert Caldwell sitting at the same bench, the same rifle resting on the same worn mat. Kane approached slowly, his hands empty, his posture humble. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He was in jeans and a plain shirt. Just a man, not a rank. "Mr. Caldwell," he said quietly. "May I sit?" Robert looked up, studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the bench. Kane sat. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The desert stretched out before them, vast and indifferent. Finally, Kane said, "I was wrong, sir. Completely wrong. I'm sorry. For what I said, for how I treated you, there's no excuse." Robert nodded slowly. "Apology accepted. Can I ask you something?" Kane said, his voice uncertain. "How did you do it? That shot, the way you read the wind, the calm, the certainty. How did you know?" Robert looked at his rifle, his hand resting on the stock. "You want to learn?" Kane nodded, his throat tight. "Then stop looking at the gear," Robert said softly. "Stop looking at the optics and the calibers and the ballistic charts. Those are tools. They help, but they're not what makes the shot." He tapped his temple. "Start looking at the world. Feel the wind. Watch the mirage. Listen to the silence between your heartbeats. The rifle is just steel and wood. The real weapon is here." He tapped his chest, and here. He tapped his head. Kane nodded, the lesson sinking in deeper than any classroom instruction ever had. "Come back next week," Robert said. "Bring your rifle, not your ego. I'll show you what the wind is saying." Kane's eyes widened. "You'd teach me? After everything?" Robert smiled, a small, tired smile. "Son, if I only taught people who'd never made mistakes, I'd never teach anyone. If this story of quiet courage and hard-learned humility moved you, honor the legacy of the warriors who walk among us. Like, share, and subscribe to Veterans Past Stories, because every veteran has a story, and every story deserves to be told."